They thought they could scare me into paying $30,000, an outrageous fine for a violation I supposedly committed on property that wasn't even under their control. The HOA board strutted into my life like kings, waving their letters and threats, telling me my cabin had to follow their rules. They didn't realize they were stepping way out of line literally. My cabin sat outside their jurisdiction, but they wouldn't listen. They sent notices, added late fees, and even threatened to put a lien on my cabin. Every letter was filled with arrogance, like they believed no one could challenge them. It was more than just money. They wanted to set an example, to make sure everyone in the area feared them. I knew something they didn't. The law wasn't on their side, and the more they pushed, the more they exposed themselves. What they didn't expect was that their overreach would lead them straight into a courtroom, and that the truth I had in my back pocket would turn the tables so fast they'd wish they'd never heard my name. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of people who think a clipboard and a title give them power over others. They thought I'd roll over, but by the time this was over, their board wouldn't just lose the case, they'd face something far worse than a fine. They'd face justice. Asterisk, I had owned my mountain cabin for almost 7 years, and in all that time, I had never had a single problem. It sat on a quiet ridge surrounded by tall pine trees, so far away from the city that you could barely get cell service. That was part of the charm. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, and even then, he only came up once in a while to hunt. I bought the place for peace. No traffic, no noisy neighbors, no politics, and certainly no HOA breathing down my neck. My weekends there were sacred. I'd arrive late Friday night, build a fire, and wake up Saturday morning to a view that made the whole work week worth it. It was one of those Saturday mornings in late spring when the trouble first arrived. The sun had just risen, and the cabin was bathed in soft gold light. I was sitting on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee when I remembered I hadn't checked my mail back in the city all week. I didn't get much mail here at the cabin, just the occasional delivery or letter from a friend. So when I drove into town for groceries later that day, I swung by my house to grab the stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk, but one thick envelope stood out. The return address had a name I didn't recognize, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. At first, I thought it might have been misdelivered. I didn't live in Maple Ridge, had never heard of it, and my cabin wasn't part of any neighborhood, let alone one with an HOA. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I tore the envelope open and pulled out several sheets of official-looking paper. The first line made my eyebrows shoot up. Notice, OF non-compliance, it said in bold letters. Below that, a paragraph accused me of violating HOA property standards and informed me I owed $5,000 in fines. My jaw dropped. I actually laughed out loud, certain it had to be some kind of clerical error. But as I kept reading, the laughter faded. They listed unauthorized exterior modifications, failure to maintain landscaping, and non-standard building materials as my offenses. It was almost comical. My cabin didn't even have a lawn, just pine needles and wild grass. I tossed the letter onto the counter, shaking my head. It was so absurd that I didn't even bother calling them right away. I figured it would be a waste of time. But over the next few weeks, more letters came. Each one was a little harsher in tone. The fines increased to $5,000, became $12,000, then $18,000, then $25,000. By the time the fourth letter arrived, they were claiming I owed $30,000. The last page threatened legal action and mentioned something about placing a lien on my property. That was when I stopped laughing. I knew HOAs could be aggressive with homeowners in their communities, but I also knew they had no authority outside their boundaries. My cabin was a good 4 miles from the nearest HOA-managed neighborhood. The idea that they could fine me for anything was ridiculous, but the threat of a lien wasn't something I could ignore. Even if they were bluffing, I needed to make sure they didn't mess with my property title or cause trouble down the road. I decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the latest letter. After a couple of rings, a woman answered with a clipped, almost bored tone. Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. This is Karen speaking. Hi Karen, my name's Daniel Harper, I began. I think there's been a mistake. I've been getting letters from your HOA saying I owe fines, but my cabin isn't in Maple Ridge. It's on private land. Before I could finish, she interrupted me. Yes, Mr. Harper, I'm aware of your situation. The board has determined that your property falls under our jurisdiction now. I blinked in disbelief. Excuse me, how is that possible? You can't just decide that. It's already been decided, she said, her voice dripping with that slow, patronizing tone people use when they think you're too dumb to understand. Our community has expanded, and your cabin is within our area of influence. You'll need to bring your property up to our standards. I couldn't help but laugh. Area of influence. This isn't some medieval kingdom, Kieran. You have zero legal authority over my property. I'm not paying you a dime. There was a pause, and her voice lost its fake politeness. If you choose not to comply, we will take the appropriate legal steps. You should know, Mr. Harper, the board does not take these matters lightly. Neither do I said, and hung up. I thought that would be the end of it. I assumed once they realized I wasn't some pushover, they'd leave me alone. But instead, the next week brought not just another letter, but a certified one, the kind you have to sign for. This one was more aggressive than ever. It repeated the $30,000 fine and set a deadline for payment. It also included photos, grainy shots clearly taken from the road, showing my cabin, the woodpile I kept stacked out front, and even the fire pit I'd built years ago. The caption under each photo listed it as a violation. Now it wasn't just harassment, it was starting to feel like stalking. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with all the letters spread out in front of me. I knew I had two options: ignore them and hope they gave up, or go on the offensive. I'd always been the type to avoid unnecessary conflict, but this was different. If I ignored them, there was a chance they could cause me real legal trouble, even if they had no grounds. Some HOAs played dirty, and I wasn't about to gamble with my property the next morning. I drove down to the county clerk's office. It was a small building with the smell of old paper and coffee. Behind the counter was a clerk named Angela, who had been working there for years and knew every property map in the area like the back of her hand. "Angela," I said, leaning on the counter, "I've got a weird question. Do you have the official map showing the boundaries for the Maple Ridge HOA?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you need that for?" I explained the situation, and she chuckled in disbelief. "You're kidding me? Your cabin's way out past their territory?" She disappeared into a back room and returned with a large folder. Inside were detailed maps, each one stamped and dated by the county. She spread one out on the counter, pointed to the shaded area marked Maple Ridge HOA, and then tapped a spot several inches outside it. "That's your cabin," she said. "Miles away. They can't touch you. Can I get a certified copy of that?" I asked. "You can get 10 if you want," she said with a grin. By the time I left, I had copies of the map, the HOA's filed charter, and the legal description of my land from the county records. I also had a burning sense of satisfaction. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one, but this time, I'd be the one bringing it to their doorstep. That night, I called an old friend of mine, Mark, who worked as a property attorney. We'd gone to college together, and I knew he'd be just as annoyed by this nonsense as I was. After I explained everything, he let out a low whistle. Double quotes, Dan. "This isn't just overreach," he said. "This is harassment. They're knowingly trying to collect money they have no right to. That's fraudulent billing at the very least. If they've been threatening to seize your property, we could even be looking at attempted extortion." Hearing it put in those terms made my blood boil. They weren't just being bullies, they were breaking the law. Mark suggested we start by sending them a formal cease and desist letter, citing the county records and demanding they stop all contact. But he also advised me to keep every single piece of correspondence, every voicemail, every photo they sent. "If they keep pushing," he said, "we'll take it to court. And believe me, once a judge sees those maps, this won't end well for them." I agreed, and we spent the next couple of hours drafting the letter. By the time we were done, it was ironclad professional, factual, and backed by hard evidence. I printed it, signed it, and sent it via certified mail the very next morning. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't know yet if they'd back off or double down, but I did know one thing: I wasn't going to be intimidated. This was my land, my cabin, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of strangers with clipboards and fake authority take that from me. Little did I know, that letter would only be the opening shot in a battle that would spill into the courtroom and end with the HOA board facing consequences they never saw coming. 3 days after sending the cease and desist letter, I got the confirmation slip back from the post office showing that the Maple Ridge HOA had signed for it. I imagined the envelope landing on their desk, the president, Karen, tearing it open, and her smug expression fading as she read the words. For a brief moment, I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe they'd realized they had been caught red-handed and would quietly back off before things got ugly, but that hope lasted less than a week. On the following Tuesday, I got home from work to find yet another envelope in my mailbox. This one was thinner than the others, just a single page, but the tone was unmistakable. At the top, in bold capital letters, read, "Final notice before legal action." The letter claimed that my refusal to comply was forcing the HOA to proceed with collection measures. They repeated the $30,000 fine and gave me 14 days to pay. At the bottom, in a sharp, almost taunting scrawl, was a handwritten note. "This is your last chance, Mr. Harper. KW." That was it. The gloves were off. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Mark, my attorney friend. Within minutes, he called me back. "This is perfect," he said. "They just ignored a formal legal notice and doubled down. That's going to look terrible for them in court." "Good," I said. "Because I'm done playing nice, we decided to escalate." Mark began drafting a formal complaint to file with the county court, but before we pulled that trigger, he suggested a clever move: document everything in person. "If we can prove they've been actively targeting you, not just sending mail, that'll help our case. We need to show intent." That Friday, I decided to spend the night at the cabin. I arrived just before sunset, unpacked, and settled in with a cold beer on the porch. The forest was quiet except for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional crack of a twig under some animal's foot. It was peaceful. Until at WASN around 9 o'clock, I noticed headlights creeping along the dirt road that passed by my property. At first I figured it was just a lost driver or maybe my neighbor checking in. But then the car slowed to a crawl right in front of my cabin. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the glare, but I caught the glint of something, a camera lens. The flash went off twice. Then, without a word, the car sped up and disappeared into the dark. I stood there for a few seconds, stunned. They were actually sending people out here to spy on me. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a motion-activated security camera system. By noon, I had them installed around the property, pointing toward the road and driveway. If they wanted to keep playing games, fine, I'd have their every move recorded. Sure enough, the very next weekend, the cameras caught a familiar sight. The same car, slowly rolling by, camera aimed out the window. The driver this time was a middle man in a polo shirt. I didn't recognize him, but Mark later told me he was one of the HOA board members. The timing couldn't have been better. Just as we were gathering this evidence, Mark filed the lawsuit. The complaint listed multiple counts: harassment, fraudulent billing, defamation of property, and attempted extortion. We included certified copies of the county maps showing my property was outside their jurisdiction, along with every letter, every voicemail, and now the surveillance footage of their little drive-bys. When the court papers were served to the HOA, I imagined the scene. Some process server walking up to their shiny office, handing the thick packet of documents to the receptionist, and saying, "You've been served." The satisfaction was almost enough to make up for the stress of the last month. Almost 2 weeks later, I got my first taste of how the HOA planned to defend themselves. I came home from work to find a manila envelope on my porch. Inside was a letter from their attorney, a man named Stephen Cole, who clearly thought very highly of himself. The letter was dripping with legal jargon, claiming that my property benefited from proximity to the Maple Ridge community, and that I was subject to shared use agreements under something called implied jurisdiction. Implied jurisdiction. I read that line 3 times before laughing so hard I had to sit down. It sounded like something they'd pulled from a bad TV courtroom drama. Essentially, their argument was that because my cabin was near their neighborhood, near being a generous word for 4 miles away, they had the right to enforce their rules. Mark wasn't laughing though. "It's garbage," he said, "but it's also exactly the kind of nonsense some HOAs try to get away with. Don't worry, the judge will tear it apart." The first pretrial hearing was set for early summer. In the meantime, the HOA decided to crank up the pressure. They started sending letters not just to me, but to my neighbors, the handful of folks who owned cabins along the ridge. I found out about it when my neighbor Bill, an old retired guy who lived there year-round, came knocking on my door. "Dan, what the hell is this?" he said, waving a letter in my face. It was from the HOA, warning that unauthorized activities on my property were bringing down the community's value and might affect surrounding property owners. "They're trying to turn the neighbors against me," I said, shaking my head. Bill snorted. "Good luck with that. We're all sick of outsiders thinking they can tell us what to do out here." Still, it was a dirty move. They weren't just harassing me anymore, they were trying to poison the well. That backfired in the best possible way though. Instead of siding with them, my neighbors started rallying behind me. A few of them even offered to testify in court about the HOA's intimidation tactics. The closer we got to the first hearing, the more I noticed a shift in my own mindset. At the start, all I'd wanted was for them to leave me alone. But now, after the spying, the lies, and the harassment of my neighbors, I wanted something more. I wanted to win so decisively that they'd never pull a stunt like this again with anyone. When the hearing day finally arrived, I walked into the county courthouse with Mark at my side. The room was small, with wood-paneled walls and the faint smell of old paper. Across the aisle sat the HOA's board members, including Karen, who looked just as smug as she had sounded on the phone weeks earlier. She wore a bright red blazer, sat with her arms crossed, and avoided eye contact with me. The judge called the session to order, and Mark got straight to the point. He laid out the certified county maps, highlighting the clear boundary lines and pointing to where my property sat well outside them. He showed the letters, the photos, the surveillance footage. He even played a recording of one of Karen's voicemails, where she'd threatened to seize my cabin if I didn't comply. The HOA's attorney tried to argue implied jurisdiction, but the judge actually chuckled at the phrase. "Counselor," he said, "this is not how property law works." Karen's smug expression faltered just a bit at that dot by the end of the hearing. The judge issued a preliminary order instructing the HOA to cease all contact with me until the final ruling and warning them that continued harassment could result in additional penalties. It wasn't the full victory yet, but it was a massive first step. As I walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. This wasn't over, but it was clear now. The tide had started to turn. They'd come after me thinking I'd roll over, but all they'd done was walk straight into a fight they couldn't win. The morning after the first hearing, I woke up at the cabin feeling lighter than I had in months. The judge's temporary order had been clear. The HOA was to stop contacting me. No more letters, no more voicemails, no more intimidation. For the first time in weeks, I could drink my coffee on the porch without expecting a strange car to crawl by with a camera sticking out the window. But if there was one thing I had learned about people like Karen and her HOA board, it was that they didn't know how to back down gracefully. Losing even a small battle seemed to light a fire under them, and I had a gut feeling they weren't finished. That feeling turned out to be right. It started subtly. 2 days after the hearing, I drove into town for supplies. On the community bulletin board outside the grocery store, someone had pinned up a flyer with a photo of my cabin. The headline read, "Unregulated property threatens community safety." The text below accused me of storing dangerous materials on my land and warned that actions may be taken to protect neighboring residents. The flyer didn't name the HOA directly, but the language was straight out of their letters. I tore it down and stuffed it in my truck, but I wasn't angry. I was almost pleased. This was a direct violation of the judge's order. They might have thought they were being clever by making it anonymous, but anyone could see where it came from. I called Mark as soon as I got home. "You're going to love this," I said, describing the flyer. "Perfect," he said without missing a beat. "Keep it. We'll present it at the next hearing." Every little misstep they make just piles onto their trouble. Still, the fact that they were willing to keep poking the bear made me cautious. I left my security cameras running 24/7 and started checking them every night. That's how I caught their next move. It was a Thursday evening, and I was reviewing the footage from earlier that day when I saw it. 2 people in khaki vests, walking up the edge of my driveway. They weren't neighbors. I'd never seen them before. One carried a clipboard, the other had a measuring tape. They walked around the edge of my property line, scribbling notes and taking pictures. At one point, one of them even stepped across the fence and onto my land before quickly backing out. I zoomed in on the video. The man with the clipboard was the same middle-aged guy I'd caught driving by before, one of the HOA board members. I sent the footage straight to Mark. His reply came within minutes. "These people are digging their own grave." By this point, the lawsuit had drawn some attention in the community. Word had spread through my neighbors and even reached folks in town. One afternoon, I stopped at the hardware store, and the cashier, an older man named Tom, leaned over the counter. "You're the guy fighting the HOA, right?" he said with a grin. "Guilty," I said. "They've been pushing people around for years. You win this thing, you'll be doing the whole county a favor." That was the thing. The more I talked to people, the more stories I heard. An older couple told me the HOA had tried to fine them for putting a bench in their own yard. Another guy said they'd been sending letters to his niece, claiming she owed maintenance fees on land she'd inherited that wasn't even in their neighborhood. This wasn't just me, it was a pattern that gave me an idea. If we could show in court that the HOA had a history of overstepping their boundaries, it would strengthen my case and paint them as serial offenders. Over the next few weeks, I collected statements from these people. Some were hesitant at first. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves, but once they saw my evidence and realized I wasn't backing down, they came forward. By the time the second hearing rolled around, I had 5 sworn affidavits from other property owners who'd been harassed by the same HOA. The second hearing was where things really started to turn in my favor. Karen and the board members came in looking tense. Their lawyer, Stephen Cole, shuffled papers and avoided eye contact with me. Mark started by presenting the new evidence: the flyer from the grocery store, the surveillance footage of the board members trespassing, and the sworn statements from other property owners. The judge leaned back in his chair, flipping through each document slowly. "Ms. Wilcox," he said finally, looking straight at Karen, "were you or your board involved in distributing this flyer?" Karen hesitated. "Not directly, Your Honor." The judge's eyebrow lifted. "Not directly. Our community members may have taken it upon themselves too." "Ms. Wilcox," the judge interrupted, "you and your board are under a court order to cease all contact with Mr. Harper. That includes indirect harassment. Do you understand?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, Your Honor." It was a small exchange, but it felt like a crack forming in their armor. When it was Stephen's turn to speak, he tried to pivot to the implied jurisdiction argument again, but the judge shut it down almost immediately. "Counselor, unless you can produce a legal document showing this property is under your client's jurisdiction, you are wasting the court's time." The hearing ended with another warning to the HOA and an order for them to pay a small fine for violating the cease. It wasn't a huge amount, just a couple $100, but it was symbolic. The judge was sending them a message: keep pushing and you'll pay for it. I thought that might finally get them to back down, but no. Instead, they made one last desperate move. A week after the second hearing, I received a certified letter from the county zoning office. It claimed there had been an anonymous complaint about unsafe structures on my property and that an inspection was required. The letter didn't say who had made the complaint, but I didn't need a crystal ball to figure it out. I called the zoning office and asked to speak to the inspector. He was a young guy named Aaron, and when I explained my situation, he sighed. "Yeah, I've heard about your case," he said. "Look, I have to follow up on complaints. But off the record, I can tell you this smells like a setup." "Come on out," I said. "You'll see there's nothing unsafe here." Aaron came by the next day, walked the property, checked the cabin, and within half an hour, he was done. "Everything's up to code," he said, shaking his head. "I'll file the report today. Whoever called this in wasted everyone's time." That visit turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Not only did I get a clean inspection report, but Aaron also agreed to testify that the complaint had been baseless and likely malicious. That was exactly the kind of final nail we needed by the time we prepared for the final court date. Our evidence file was thick enough to make a satisfying thud when you set it on a desk. We had the maps, the letters, the voicemails, the surveillance footage, the affidavits from other property owners, the flyer, the trespassing video, and now the zoning inspector's testimony, the HOA. All they had was a flimsy argument about implied jurisdiction and a rapidly dwindling credibility. Morning of the final hearing, I walked into the courtroom with Mark, feeling a quiet confidence. Across the aisle, Karen looked pale, and the other board members avoided my gaze. Stephen shuffled through his papers like a man who knew the ending before the last chapter was even read. And as I took my seat, I realized something. This fight, that had started because they thought they could intimidate me into paying a fine I didn't know. But now, it was about more than just my cabin. It was about holding them accountable not just for me, but for everyone they'd ever tried to bully. The final hearing was set for a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air bites at your skin just enough to wake you up, and the leaves crunch under your boots as you walk. I arrived at the courthouse early, partly because I didn't want to risk being late, but mostly because I wanted to take a moment to breathe before stepping into the room where months of stress, paperwork, and sleepless nights would finally come to a head. Mark was already there, leaning against a stone wall outside the courthouse doors, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He handed me one without a word, and we stood there in silence. For a moment, watching the traffic drift by, finally he spoke. "You ready to end this?" "More than ready," I said. Inside. The courtroom was warm, almost uncomfortably so compared to the crisp morning air. The wood-paneled walls seemed to amplify the quiet conversations happening in low voices around the room. Across the aisle, the HOA's board members sat together like a cluster of crows, dressed in dark suits that looked stiff and unnatural on some of them. Karen was in her signature bright red blazer, though her posture wasn't as rigid as it had been before. If anything, she looked restless, tapping her pen against the table, glancing toward the door as if she hoped someone would swoop in and save her from what was coming. Their attorney, Stephen Cole, was shuffling papers with a kind of forced composure, the way a man does when he's trying to look confident but knows the odds are stacked against him. When the judge entered, everyone stood, then sat again as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the docket. "We are here for the matter of Harper versus the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is the final hearing. Counsel, you may proceed." Mark started strong. He didn't waste time rehashing the obvious points. Instead, he opened with a concise timeline. When the first letter arrived, how the fines escalated, the phone conversation with Karen, the cease and desist order, and every violation that came after. Then, he began presenting the evidence in a sequence so airtight it felt like watching a lock click open with every step. First came the certified county maps, with the HOA boundary clearly shaded in blue and my cabin marked well outside it. "These are not speculative," Mark said, holding the document up. "These are the county's official maps, certified and filed. They establish without question that Mr. Harper's property is not, and has never been, within the HOA's jurisdiction." The judge nodded, flipping through the copies provided to him. Next came the letters, each one with its increasingly aggressive tone. Mark read, excerpts aloud. "Failure to comply. Lien on your property. Legal action will be taken." Then he produced the voicemail where Karen's voice was unmistakable. "We will seize your property if you don't pay." The judge's eyes narrowed at that one. After that came the surveillance footage, the same car driving slowly past my property, the board member stepping onto my land, the measuring tape in hand. Then the flyer from the grocery store bulletin board, its inflammatory language plain for everyone to see. Finally, Mark called Aaron, the zoning inspector, to the stand. Aaron testified calmly and professionally, explaining that the anonymous complaint about my unsafe structures had been baseless and appeared malicious. There were no code violations of any kind, he said. Everything was fully compliant. When Mark was finished, he stepped back and let the silence settle. Our evidence table was piled high with documents and photos, a physical reminder of just how much the HOA had done to dig their own grave. Then it was Stephen's turn. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the front of the room like a man, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about community standards. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association exists to preserve property values and ensure safety. Mr. Harper's property, while technically outside the original boundaries, benefits from proximity to Maple Ridge and, therefore, the judge cut him off. Counselor, we've already addressed this so-called implied jurisdiction. I will ask again. Do you have any legal document, deed, covenant amendment, showing this property is under your client's authority? Stephen hesitated. Not in the strictest sense, Your Honor, but that will be sufficient, the judge said. His voice final. Stephen tried to recover, pivoting to suggest that my refusal to cooperate had caused unnecessary conflict and legal expense for the HOA. He even implied that I had provoked the board by ignoring their first letters instead of responding right away. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her chin high, but her voice betrayed her nerves. Mark's cross-examination was surgical. Ms. Wilcox, did you receive the Sanders' letter sent by my client's attorney? Yes. And were you aware that it cited county records proving his property is outside your jurisdiction? I was aware that was his claim. Yes. It wasn't a claim, Ms. Wilcox. It was a certified legal fact, wasn't it? Karen shifted in her seat. I suppose so. Mark paused, then held up the flyer. Did you create or authorize the distribution of this document? No. Did you know it was being distributed? I might have heard something about it and you did nothing to stop it, despite the court order prohibiting you from contacting my client. Karen's lips pressed together. I didn't think it counted as contact. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Wilcox, indirect harassment is still harassment. You were warned about this in the previous hearing. By the time Karen stepped down, it was clear to everyone in the room that the HOA's defense was crumbling. Mark's closing statement was simple but devastating. Your Honor, this case is not just about one man's cabin. It's about the abuse of power. The Maple Ridge HOA tried to collect tens of thousands of dollars from a property they had no authority over. When confronted with the truth, they escalated their harassment. They ignored court orders. They involved his neighbors. They filed false complaints. And they did it all because they assumed Mr. Harper would be too intimidated to fight back. He wasn't. And now they must be held accountable. The judge sat back, silent for a moment. Then he removed his glasses and set them on the bench. I have heard enough, he said. He began his ruling by reaffirming that my property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. He stated plainly that their fines and threats had no legal standing whatsoever. He called their actions a clear pattern of harassment, and noted that their behavior after the Sanders' letter was in direct violation of a lawful court order. Then came the part I'll never forget. The court hereby orders the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association to cease all contact with Mr. Harper, direct or indirect, permanently. Furthermore, the HOA is to pay Mr. Harper compensatory damages in the amount of $15,000 for emotional distress, plus reimbursement of all legal fees incurred, and punitive damages in the amount of $25,000 for willful misconduct. Karen's head snapped towards Stephen, her mouth open in shock. One of the other board members muttered something under his breath and put his face in his hands. The judge wasn't finished. Additionally, given the testimony from other property owners, I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor for review of potential criminal charges related to fraudulent billing and harassment. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint creak of the wooden benches when the judge adjourned the session. I felt a weight lift from my chest so suddenly that it almost made me dizzy. Mark shook my hand firmly. That, he said with a grin, is how you put a bully in their place. As we walked out into the cool autumn air, I caught a glimpse of Karen and her board huddled together on the courthouse steps, their faces pale, their voices hushed. For the first time, they didn't look smug or untouchable. They looked small. I didn't say a word to them as I passed. I didn't need to. The victory spoke for itself. The trial began in a packed courtroom on a crisp Monday morning, the air thick with anticipation and quiet murmurs. Reporters lined the back, their cameras clicking every time someone of interest walked through the double doors. On one side, the HOA board members sat stiffly in their seats, their lawyer flipping through a thick binder of documents. On the other, I sat with my attorney, my hands folded on the polished table in front of me. I wasn't nervous anymore. Months of preparation and mountains of evidence had replaced fear with a sense of steady confidence. This was the day the truth would finally be laid bare for all to see. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for having no patience for nonsense, called the court to order. The HOA's lawyer started with his opening statement, painting a picture of a homeowner who had flouted community rules and ignored repeated notices of violation. He tried to make it sound as if I were a reckless property owner who thought the rules didn't apply to me. But I could see from the judge's expression that he wasn't buying the story without solid proof. When it was our turn, my attorney stood up and calmly explained the core issue. My cabin was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, completely outside their mapped boundaries, and, therefore, they had no authority to fine me, let alone threaten me with property seizure. He didn't speak with theatrics. Instead, he presented facts, dates, maps, and official land registry records. He made it clear this wasn't just a matter of a neighborly dispute. It was a case of overreach and intimidation by a group that had decided they could exert control where they had no right. The first witness was the county zoning officer, a middle-aged man with a nonsense attitude. He walked the court through the official county maps, pointing out the HOA's boundaries in bright red. My property was a good half-mile outside of that line. He testified that the HOA had no legal power over my land and that the fines they issued were completely invalid. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he spoke. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Next came one of my neighbors, a retired schoolteacher who had been quietly following the whole situation. She testified about how the HOA had been trying to bully other property owners too, sending threatening letters for supposed violations that had nothing to do with HOA rules. She described seeing board members walking onto my property without permission, taking photos, and even measuring parts of my land as if they had the right to inspect it. Her voice cracked with indignation, and her sincerity was impossible to miss. The HOA's lawyer tried to push back during cross-examination, suggesting that there was community confusion about the boundaries. But my attorney countered swiftly, asking why if they were so unsure they had confidently issued $30,000 in fines and threatened legal action. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the presentation of my own evidence. My attorney projected a large aerial photograph of my land, with the HOA boundaries marked clearly. The image was so undeniable that even the judge leaned forward for a closer look. We presented copies of every letter and email the HOA had sent me, all demanding payment. Then we showed the replies we had sent, each one explaining they had no jurisdiction, and each one ignored. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a willful act. The tension in the courtroom reached a peak when my attorney brought up the HOA's internal emails, which we had obtained through legal discovery. One particular email stood out, the HOA president writing to another board member. I know it's outside our mapped area, but if we don't challenge him, others might try to build without us. So that one line made their entire defense crumble. It showed they knew exactly what they were doing and they did it anyway. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the HOA's lawyer looked exhausted. He tried to appeal to the integrity of the community in the spirit of shared responsibility, but it rang hollow. My attorney ended with a simple but powerful statement. This case isn't about shared responsibility, it's about abuse of power. And the law is clear: when you don't have the authority, you cannot take what isn't yours. The judge left to deliberate, but it didn't take long. Less than an hour later, he returned with his decision. His ruling was firm and direct. The HOA's fines were void and illegal. They were ordered to reimburse me for all legal expenses and pay additional damages for harassment and trespassing. Furthermore, the judge referred the matter to the state attorney general's office for potential criminal charges against board members for fraud and abuse of authority. The reaction in the courtroom was instant. The board members' faces fell, some looking pale, others glaring at each other as if trying to shift the blame. My neighbors in the back row smiled, some even whispering congratulations. The reporters began scribbling furiously, knowing this was going to be headline news. Walking out of that courtroom felt like walking into sunlight after months in a storm. The fight had been long, draining, and at times infuriating, but in the end, justice had been served. I knew this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a warning to every HOA that thought they could bend the law to suit their own agendas. In the weeks that followed, the board resigned under public pressure. The HOA faced ongoing investigations, and several members were barred from holding similar positions in the future. As for my cabin, it stood untouched, a quiet refuge just as it was meant to be. Every time I sat on the porch listening to the wind in the trees, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that I had stood my ground. And one dot to everyone who's ever been on the wrong end of an HOA's overreach. Let this story be a reminder: you have rights, and if you fight for them, the truth has a way of cutting through even the thickest layers of intimidation. For more real-life stories like this, watch Bright Reality on YouTube. For videos, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.